So there I was, finally living the dream. 5 acres of peace, quiet, and a garden I promised my mom I'd build. What could go wrong, right? Well, in strolls Dolores Tatum, clipboard in hand, ready to slap me with a $5,000 0 cents fine for grass that's too tall. Yeah, you read that right, too tall. But that's just the beginning. She doesn't stop there. No, she calls the cops on me 3 times, and then, wait for it, hires a fake officer to come harass me like I'm some kind of criminal mastermind. Ever had an HOA Karen do this? I bet you have. Drop your wildest HOA stories in the comments. I need a laugh before my own life gets more ridiculous. Let me paint you a picture of what should have been the happiest day of my life. I'm Wesley Corbin, 60 years old, and after managing a fishing store for nearly 3 decades, I'd finally saved enough to buy my mom's dream property. 5 acres of paradise in Meadowbrook Ranch, complete with lake access and the perfect spot for the memorial garden my mother had described from her hospital bed. The moving truck was already there when I pulled up, and Tommy Williams, who everyone calls Tank, was directing his crew efficiently. The ranch was everything the listing promised. A modest 3-bedroom house with a wraparound porch overlooking rolling hills and a small lake that sparkled in the morning sun. I walked to the front door with my mom's urn tucked under my arm, her fishing locket hanging around my neck like it had every day since the funeral. The weight felt right, like coming home. I whispered to the urn, "We made it, Ma, just like you wanted." The plan was simple. Get settled over the weekend, then hold a ceremony next Saturday to scatter her ashes in the garden spot she'd circled on the property photos. She had been so excited about this place, talking about tomatoes and wildflowers, until cancer took her voice. This ranch wasn't just my new home, it was fulfilling a promise to a dying woman. Tank's crew was unloading boxes when I spotted her marching across the yard like a general heading into battle. Dolores Tatum, the neighborhood watchdog, marched over in a wrinkled floral shirt and stretched leggings, holding a clipboard like a weapon. Her oversized glasses kept sliding down her nose, and the scowl on her face suggested she'd been practicing it in the mirror. Before I could introduce myself, she planted herself in front of the moving truck and held up one hand like a crossing guard stopping traffic. "Stop right there," she barked, and every bird in a 3-mile radius went quiet. "This property is in violation of HOA regulations, and I'm shutting down this operation immediately." She waved her clipboard like she was conducting an orchestra of crazy, then thrust a piece of paper toward me with dramatic flair. I took the paper, expecting maybe a noise complaint, but what I read made my blood pressure spike. $5,000 fine, I read aloud. Grass height exceeds community standards. I looked from the paper to Dolores to my perfectly normal yard, wondering if I'd stumbled into an alternate dimension where lawn care was a federal crime. "I bought this place yesterday," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. How could I be in violation? Dolores didn't even glance at the paper. She just tilted her head, eyes sharp. "Rules are rules," she replied, almost mocking me. "And you should have done your research before buying here. Maybe you should have done your research before purchasing property in a premium community like Meadowbrook Ranch." She tapped her pen against the clipboard with woodpecker rhythm, each tap punctuating her authority. Tank had stopped supervising and was watching this exchange with the fascination of someone witnessing a train wreck. I pulled out my closing paperwork and flipped to the HOA section. The grass height regulation clearly stated 4 inches maximum, not 2. I showed this to Dolores, pointing to the specific line, but she barely glanced before shaking her head. "Those are old regulations," she said dismissively. "The HOA board updated our community standards last week. All residents received notification, except I hadn't received any notification because I hadn't been a resident last week. A fact that seemed to escape Dolores entirely. Or maybe it didn't escape her at all. Maybe this was exactly what she'd been planning. Tank finally stepped forward, his considerable bulk casting a shadow over Dolores's tiny frame. "Lady," he said patiently, "this guy just bought the place. He hasn't even moved in yet. How's he supposed to maintain grass that was already here?" Dolores turned her withering gaze on Tank like he'd suggested burning down the clubhouse. "I don't recall asking for your opinion, Mr. Moving Man," she said, emphasizing those last words like an insult. "This is HOA business, and unless you're a property owner in Meadowbrook Ranch, you need to mind your own business." That's when I touched my mom's locket, grounding myself in her memory. I couldn't back down now. "My mother dreamed of a place like this her whole life," I said, emotion creeping into my voice. "She died 6 months ago, and this ranch was the last thing we talked about before cancer took her. I expected at least a flicker of sympathy, maybe an apology for the misunderstanding, but Dolores's expression remained cold as January lake water. "Well," she said, adjusting her glasses again, "maybe you should have bought somewhere more appropriate for your circumstances." The casual cruelty hit me like a slap and I felt my jaw clench involuntarily. I tried to be reasonable with Dolores that first day. That was my first mistake, because she was about to escalate this from annoying neighbor to full-blown war criminal, and I had no idea what I was really dealing with. The next morning, I measured the grass with a ruler, trying to avoid any more trouble. Harlan Vance, my neighbor to the east, was watching from his fence line with the expression reserved for witnessing someone's dignity being slowly stripped away. He was a weathered man in his late 50s, with calloused hands of someone who'd worked his entire life, and when he shook his head at my grass measuring performance, I felt the full weight of how absurd this situation had become. "Son," Harlan called over, "you don't need to be doing this. That woman's got no right to treat you like a criminal." I brushed dirt off my knees and walked to the fence where Harlan stood. "I just want to avoid more problems," I said, though I knew I was being naive. "She's already cost me $5,000, and I haven't even finished moving in." Harlan's expression darkened and he glanced around like he was checking for surveillance. "She's been doing this for months. You're just the next target." Before I could ask what he meant, I discovered exactly how far Dolores was willing to escalate things. I'd gone inside for water when I heard Tank calling my name with urgent panic. I rushed back out to find a police officer on my front porch, except something about the scene felt wrong. The uniform didn't fit right, hanging loose in some places and too tight in others, like it had been borrowed from someone with a different body type. The badge looked like something from a costume shop, with edges too shiny and lettering slightly wrong. Most telling, there was no police car, just a beat-up sedan that had seen better decades. "Officer Johnson, Meadowbrook Police," the man said, but his voice cracked on the word police, like he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "Sir, we've had reports of suspicious activity on this property, and I need you to vacate immediately, pending investigation." I pulled out my phone and started recording, and I could see the fake officer's eyes darting nervously toward the camera. "Suspicious activity? What exactly are you accusing me of?" I demanded, my tone firm. "And I'll need to see identification and a warrant, or I'm calling the real police." The man hesitated, his hand briefly brushing his belt, before realizing he had nothing to show. Tank stepped beside me, his massive frame making the fake officer look ridiculous in his ill-fitting costume. "Officer," Tank said with manufactured respect, "we've been moving this man's belongings into his legally purchased property. What seems suspicious about that?" The fake officer was clearly out of his depth, probably expecting to intimidate someone into compliance rather than face actual questions. "You need to leave immediately," he repeated, but the conviction had gone out of his voice. "We'll be back with proper documentation." And with that brilliant display of law enforcement expertise, he turned and hurried back to his beat-up sedan. The moment his car disappeared, I called the real Meadowbrook Police Department. The dispatcher sounded genuinely confused when I asked about Officer Johnson. "Sir, we don't have any Officer Johnson on our force," she said, "and we haven't received any reports of suspicious activity in your area today. Would you like to file a report about someone impersonating a police officer?" That's when the pieces started falling into place, and I realized Dolores hadn't just escalated to harassment. She'd graduated to hiring people to commit actual crimes. Harlan had witnessed the whole exchange and came over as soon as the fake officer left. "I've been watching that whole thing," he said, shaking his head in disgust. "That wasn't no real cop. And I've seen that same guy talking to Dolores outside the community center last week." He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo he'd taken, apparently having the same instincts about documentation that I was developing. "Wesley, I think it's time you knew what you're really dealing with. I worked for county utilities for 30 years, and I know every pipe and drain in this area. But more importantly, I know what Dolores has been planning." That's when Harlan told me about survey stakes that had appeared overnight on 3 different properties, including mine, all lakefront lots that would be worth millions to the right developer. He'd seen Dolores meeting with men in expensive suits, pointing at properties, and talking in hushed tones about timelines and clearances. "She's not just targeting you, Wesley. She's been working with developers, and your place is the jewel in their plan." The pieces finally clicked together, and it wasn't just about petty rules anymore. It was about land, money, and the lengths Dolores would go to. But if I thought fake police officers were the worst thing Dolores had planned, I was about to learn how wrong I could be. When I returned from lunch, I found my ranch gate secured with an industrial chain and padlock, with a professionally printed sign reading "Property under HOA investigation, no entry authorized." Tank's crew was standing around looking confused, half my belongings still on the truck, and my mother's urn sitting on my kitchen table inside a house I could no longer access. Dolores had essentially imprisoned my dead mother while holding my property hostage, and as I stood staring at that chain, I felt something shift from frustration to cold, calculating anger. Locked out of my own house with my mother's ashes inside, I realized Dolores had just made the biggest mistake of her life. See, when you corner a guy who knows every water pipe in the county, well, let's just say payback flows downhill. Standing outside my own property like a trespasser, I was understanding why Harlan had looked so sympathetic when he'd seen me measuring grass with a ruler. This wasn't just about HOA regulations or property disputes. This was systematic harassment designed to break people down until they gave up and walked away. But Dolores had miscalculated. She'd targeted someone who'd learned patience and persistence from 3 decades of managing a fishing store, where dealing with difficult customers and solving complex problems was daily routine. More importantly, she'd picked a fight with someone who had absolutely nothing left to lose, except a promise to a dead mother. The first thing I needed was to get back inside my house, and fortunately, Dolores's security measures were about as sophisticated as her fake police officer. I'd grown up in a family where locking yourself out was regular occurrence, so I knew the kitchen window on the north side had a latch that didn't quite catch properly. It took 30 seconds to pop that window open and climb through, feeling like a burglar breaking into my own home. The first thing I did was grab my mother's urn from the kitchen table, holding it close and whispering another apology for the chaos surrounding what should have been a peaceful transition to her final resting place. I gathered important documents, camping gear, and clothes for a few days, figuring I might need to sleep in my truck until this mess got sorted out. But as I was packing, Harlan appeared at my kitchen door with a manila folder and an expression suggesting he had information I needed to hear. "Wesley," he said, glancing around like he was checking for surveillance, "I think it's time you understood exactly what you're up against. I've been documenting Dolores's activities for months, ever since she pulled the same stunt on the Henderson family last year." He opened the folder to reveal county utility maps, property surveys, and photographs that told a story I was only beginning to understand. This area was once a marsh that flooded, and the only thing keeping it dry now is a series of drainage pipes under Dolores's rose garden. He pointed to a specific location on the map, and I could see the engineering that kept an entire section of expensive homes from returning to their natural swampy state. The implications were starting to dawn on me, and I found myself studying those maps with focused attention. "What happens if those drainage systems get clogged?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Harlan's grin suggested he'd been hoping someone would ask that exact question. "Well, let's just say the natural drainage in that area isn't reliable. Mother Nature has a long memory, and she doesn't forget when people try to build where water wants to flow." He showed me more maps, detailed drawings of pipe systems and water flow patterns that he'd helped install during his 3 decades with the county. Of course, we wouldn't want to damage anything or break any laws, but if someone were to help restore the area's natural drainage patterns during a heavy rainstorm, well, that might just be considered environmental restoration. That afternoon, Harlan and I took a walk through the neighborhood, ostensibly just 2 neighbors getting acquainted, but actually conducting reconnaissance on Dolores's operation. We positioned ourselves in a grove of oak trees that provided perfect cover while giving us a clear view of the community center where Dolores held court. What we saw and heard over the next 2 hours was like watching a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association. Dolores was on her phone most of the time, and her voice carried clearly across the parking lot as she discussed timelines, clearances, and profit margins with someone who was obviously not just a casual acquaintance. "Once I clear these last 3 properties, you'll have complete lake access for development," she was saying, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "The Corbin place is key because it sits right in the middle of the waterfront parcels." I was recording every word, building a case that was becoming stronger by the minute. The Henderson family took 6 months to break, but this Corbin guy seems more stubborn. We might need to escalate the pressure. The casual way she discussed destroying people's lives, like she was talking about removing weeds from a garden, made my blood boil. But it also confirmed what Harlan had suspected. This wasn't personal harassment. It was a business operation designed to force out homeowners so their properties could be acquired cheaply and resold to developers. "She tried the same thing with my property last year," Harlan whispered as we listened to Dolores plan my destruction. "Started with violations and fines, then moved on to intimidation and harassment. The only reason she backed off was because I threatened to contact the county about some of her creative interpretations of HOA authority." He showed me photos on his phone of survey stakes that had appeared on his property, mysteriously disappearing after he'd made some strategic phone calls to old colleagues in the utilities department. But you're different, Wesley. Your property is the centerpiece of whatever development deal she's working. She's not going to back down easily. That evening, I made a trip to the hardware store, officially shopping for landscaping supplies, but actually gathering tools I'd need for what Harlan was calling environmental restoration. PVC pipe, drainage gravel, and a few other items that would help Mother Nature reclaim what had been taken from her 60 years ago. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. We weren't going to break anything or damage anyone's property. We were just going to help water flow where it naturally wanted to go. You sure about this? Harlan asked as we loaded supplies into my truck. Once we start this, there's no going back. I touched my mother's locket, feeling the weight of the promise I'd made and the determination that had carried me through the worst year of my life. Mom always said patience beats anger, I replied, but she also taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what's right. Tomorrow night, when that storm hit, Dolores was going to learn why you never mess with a fisherman's understanding of water. But first, she had one more surprise for me that would push this conflict past the point of no return. The next morning brought news that should have made me nervous, but instead filled me with anticipation. The weather forecast called for heavy rain starting around midnight, the kind of sustained downpour that could drop 3 or 4 inches in a few hours and turn every storm drain in the county into a raging river. Harlan stopped by early with coffee and detailed weather analysis that only someone who'd spent 30 years managing water systems could provide. This is the kind of storm that tests every drainage system in the area, he said, studying his phone's weather app like a general reviewing battle plans. If there's any weakness in the infrastructure, tonight's the night it's going to show. But before I could focus entirely on weather patterns and water flow, Dolores decided to play what she probably thought was her winning hand. A notice about an emergency HOA meeting appeared on every door, signaling trouble. Emergency session, addressing threats to community safety and property values, the notice read, and I didn't need a degree in political science to figure out who the threat was supposed to be. The meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. at the community center, giving Dolores plenty of time to rally her supporters and prepare her character assassination. I arrived at the community center early, slipping in through the back door and positioning myself where I could record everything without being immediately noticed. The room was fuller than I'd expected, maybe 40 or 50 residents who'd apparently dropped their evening plans to hear about the dangerous individual in their midst. Dolores cleaned herself up, trying to hide her true nature, but her mask couldn't conceal the venom in her words. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dolores began, her voice carrying authority that suggested she'd been practicing this speech, "we have a dangerous individual in our community who represents a clear threat to our property values and our way of life." She gestured toward poster-sized photos of my property, images that had clearly been taken with a telephoto lens and edited to make everything look as messy and threatening as possible. Wesley Corbin has shown complete disregard for our community standards, has been uncooperative with legitimate HOA enforcement, and has demonstrated behavior that I can only describe as unstable and potentially violent. The casual way she threw around words like dangerous and violent made it clear that this wasn't just about property maintenance. This was about destroying my reputation and driving me out entirely. Several residents asked questions about specific violations and evidence, and Dolores had clearly prepared for this moment. She produced documentation that looked official, photos that appeared damning, and testimony from witnesses whose credibility seemed unquestionable. What she didn't know was that I'd been recording her fake police officer encounter, her phone conversations about development deals, and every interaction we'd had since I'd arrived in Meadowbrook Ranch. When she called for a vote to authorize legal action to force my removal from the community, I decided it was time to introduce some actual evidence into the proceedings. "Excuse me," I said, standing up from my position in the back of the room, and the silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. "I think the community deserves to hear the whole story before making any decisions." I pulled out my phone and connected it to the room's audio system, something I'd learned during my years managing a fishing store where we regularly hosted educational presentations. "This is a recording of the police officer Mrs. Tatum sent to my property yesterday." The sound quality was crystal clear, and every word of the fake officer's bumbling performance filled the room. When the recording reached the part where he claimed to be investigating suspicious activity but couldn't produce identification or a warrant, the murmur of confusion from the audience was audible. But the real shock came when I played the recording of Dolores's phone conversation about development deals and profit sharing. "Once I clear these last 3 properties, you'll have complete lake access for development," her voice said through the speaker system, and the transformation in the room was immediate. The room shifted as the audience's confusion turned to anger. Whispers grew louder, and I could feel the momentum building. The Henderson family took 6 months to break, but this Corbin guy seems more stubborn. We might need to escalate the pressure. By the time the recording finished, Dolores looked like someone who just watched her carefully constructed house of cards collapse. The meeting devolved into chaos after that, with residents demanding explanations about development deals they'd never been told about, and questioning the legitimacy of violations and fines that suddenly seemed suspicious. Several people approached me afterward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation, painting a picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for months. Mrs. Patricia Williams told me about excessive fines for garden decorations, while Robert Chen described being cited for mailbox placement that violated regulations nobody else seemed to know about. The pattern was clear. Dolores had been using her position to target anyone who stood in the way of her development scheme. But if I thought exposing Dolores's corruption would end this conflict, I was about to learn that desperate people do desperate things. As residents filed out of the community center, shaking their heads and muttering about deception and abuse of authority, Dolores cornered me near the exit with an expression that suggested our little war was about to enter a new phase. "You think you're very clever," she hissed, her carefully composed facade finally cracking to reveal the bitter, angry woman underneath. "But you have no idea what you're dealing with. I've invested too much time and money in this project to let some trailer trash fisherman ruin everything." The mask was completely off now, and I could see the desperation in her eyes, the kind of cornered animal panic that makes people dangerous. That night, as the first raindrops began falling and I prepared for what Harlan was calling our environmental restoration project, I couldn't shake the feeling that Dolores's threats weren't just empty bluster. She'd already hired fake police officers and committed fraud with HOA documents, so there was no telling how far she might go to protect her investment. But as I looked at my mother's urn sitting on the kitchen table and touched the fishing locket that had become my source of strength, I knew that backing down wasn't an option. Tomorrow morning, Dolores was going to discover what happens when Mother Nature decides to reclaim her wetland, and I was going to make sure the whole world was watching when it happened. As the first raindrops started falling, I looked at Dolores's pristine rose garden one last time. By sunrise, she was going to discover what happens when Mother Nature takes back her wetland. I woke at dawn to the sound of silence, which was remarkable given that I'd fallen asleep to steady rain drumming on my roof. The storm had moved through exactly as predicted, dropping nearly 4 inches of water in 6 hours and testing every drainage system in Meadowbrook Ranch. But it was what I saw when I looked out my kitchen window that made me grab my phone and head outside with anticipation usually reserved for Christmas morning. Dolores's section of the neighborhood had been transformed overnight from a manicured suburban paradise into something that looked like the Florida Everglades after a hurricane. Water covered every yard, turning lawns into lakes and landscaping into aquatic gardens. Dolores's prized rose garden, the centerpiece of her personal property and the symbol of her authority over the neighborhood, was completely submerged under 18 inches of muddy water that reflected the morning sky like a mirror. Driveways had become rivers, sidewalks had disappeared entirely, and the community mailbox cluster looked like a modern art installation titled Suburbia Underwater. The natural wetland that had existed here 60 years ago had reclaimed its territory in a single night. I started the live stream from my front porch, positioning my phone to capture both the flooding in Dolores's section and the perfectly dry conditions on my higher ground. "Morning, folks," I said, my voice steady but barely hiding my satisfaction. "Watch as nature reclaims what was never meant to be taken. What you're seeing behind me is Mother Nature taking back what was always hers, a natural wetland that was filled in and built on 60 years ago." The viewer counter started climbing immediately. 50 viewers, then 100, then 200 people tuning in to watch what was rapidly becoming the most expensive lake in Meadowbrook Ranch. The comments started rolling in almost immediately, and the enthusiasm of the audience was infectious. "Get her," typed someone from Texas. "HOA Karen, meltdown incoming," wrote a viewer from California. "This is better than reality TV," commented someone whose username suggested they dealt with their own HOA nightmare. The view count kept climbing, 400, then 600, then 800 people watching live as I provided commentary on the dramatic transformation of what had been premium real estate just 12 hours earlier. "Folks, what you're witnessing is the power of proper water management and respect for natural drainage patterns," I explained, walking closer to the edge of the flood zone while keeping my feet firmly on dry ground. That's when Dolores made her grand entrance, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect if I'd choreographed it myself. Dolores splashed through the water in designer shoes and a bathrobe, her property value sinking. Her face was a masterpiece of rage and disbelief, the kind of expression that belongs in a museum dedicated to the consequences of overreach and arrogance. When she spotted me standing on my perfectly dry lawn with my phone pointed in her direction, her expression evolved from shock to pure fury in real time. "Weasley Corbin!" she screamed, her voice carrying across the water with the clarity of a foghorn, and I actually had to hold the phone away from my face to protect the microphone. "What did you do? What did you do to my property?" The beauty of her question was that I could answer it with complete honesty while maintaining my innocence. "I helped restore this area's natural wetland state," I replied calmly, angling the phone to capture both of us in the frame. "This is what this land looked like before developers decided to build houses on a floodplain." The chat was exploding with comments and laughing emojis, and the viewer count had broken through 1,000 people, who were now witnessing Dolores' very public meltdown. "You sabotaged our drainage system," she shrieked, pointing an accusatory finger at me while water lapped around her ankles. "This is terrorism. This is destruction of property. I'm calling the police." But what made this moment absolutely perfect was that I had documentation for everything we'd done, and more importantly, everything we hadn't done. "Actually, Dolores," I said, pulling out my phone's secondary camera to show the evidence I'd collected, "let me share some interesting information with our audience." I played the recording of her conversation about development deals and profit sharing, her own voice filling the morning air with confessions of corruption and fraud. "Folks, it turns out our HOA president has been running a real estate scam, trying to force out homeowners so she can sell their properties to developers." The audience response was immediate and overwhelming. Comments flooded in faster than I could read them, viewers sharing the stream with friends and family, and the local news media apparently monitoring social media for exactly this kind of content. "Expose her," wrote someone from Michigan. "Justice served," commented a viewer from Oregon. "Someone call the real police," suggested multiple people, and I realized that this was becoming much bigger than just a neighborhood dispute. The view count had passed 1,500 people, then 2,000, and climbing steadily as word spread across the internet about the HOA president who tried to steal properties and ended up flooding her own neighborhood instead. But the best part of the morning's entertainment was still to come. As Dolores stood in her flooded yard screaming threats and accusations, other residents started emerging from their houses to survey the damage. Mrs. Patricia Williams, the elderly woman who'd told me about harassment over garden decorations, came out carrying a folder of documents and wearing the expression of someone who'd finally found the perfect moment for revenge. "Dolores," she called across the water, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades dealing with bullies and fraudsters. "I think our viewers would like to hear about those fake violations you've been issuing." That's when the domino effect really started, and I realized that months of suppressed anger and frustration were about to explode into public view. Robert Chen appeared with his own documentation of bogus citations, while the Martinez family brought photos of survey stakes that had mysteriously appeared on their property. One by one, Dolores's victims stepped forward with evidence of harassment, intimidation, and fraud, turning my live stream into a public tribunal where justice was finally being served. The view count hit 3,000 people, then 4,000, as residents shared their stories and viewers shared the stream with anyone who'd ever dealt with an abusive HOA. With 4,000 people watching live, Dolores finally understood her empire was drowning. But the real surprise was about to walk through that floodwater, and it was going to change everything. The sound of sirens approaching through the morning air should have made me nervous. But when I saw the official Meadowbrook Police Department patrol car pulling up to the edge of the flood zone, I felt nothing but relief. Officer Rodriguez stepped out with the confident bearing of someone who'd been a cop long enough to recognize a genuine emergency from a manufactured crisis. And his first action was to survey the flooding with the analytical eye of a professional who understood the difference between natural disasters and human stupidity. The fact that multiple viewers had called the police department after watching my live stream had apparently convinced the department that this situation required official attention. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez called to Dolores, who was still standing in ankle-deep water and looking like a scarecrow left out in a hurricane. "I'm going to need you to step out of the water so we can discuss the situation safely." The viewer count on my stream had climbed past 5,000 people, and the comments were flowing faster than the water around Dolores's rose garden. Rodriguez approached me first, probably because I was the only person in the immediate area who wasn't soaking wet and screaming about property damage. "Sir, I understand you've been having some disputes with your HOA, and I believe you filed a report about someone impersonating a police officer?" The beauty of having everything documented became apparent when I was able to provide Officer Rodriguez with a complete timeline of events backed up by recordings, photographs, and witness statements from neighbors who'd experienced similar harassment. This recording is from the fake officer Mrs. Tatum sent to my property 2 days ago, I explained, playing the audio through my phone's speaker while thousands of people listened in through the live stream. And this is documentation of fraudulent HOA violations, property surveys conducted without permission, and evidence of a conspiracy to force homeowners out of their properties for development purposes. Rodriguez listened to everything with the patience of someone who dealt with complex fraud cases before, taking notes and asking clarifying questions while Dolores stood in her flooded yard looking increasingly desperate. "Mrs. Tatum," Rodriguez called, "I'm going to need you to join us for this conversation." Dolores sloshed through the water toward us, leaving a wake behind her like a very angry and very small boat, and the expression on her face suggested she knew this wasn't going to end well for her. "Officer, this man has destroyed our entire neighborhood," she began, but Rodriguez held up a hand to stop her mid-sentence. "Ma'am, before we discuss property damage, I need to address some serious allegations about impersonating a police officer and fraud." He pulled out his own notebook and pen, the kind of deliberate, official gesture that suggested this conversation was about to become very formal and very legal. That's when the fake Officer Johnson made his second appearance of the week, except this time he wasn't wearing a uniform or carrying a badge. He was just a middle-aged man in jeans and a t-shirt who looked like he desperately wanted to be anywhere else in the world as he approached our little gathering. "Danny!" Dolores called to him, apparently forgetting that she was supposed to pretend she didn't know him. "Tell this officer what you saw. Tell him about the suspicious activity." But Danny, whose real name turned out to be Daniel Tatum, Dolores' cousin, looked at Officer Rodriguez with the expression of someone who just realized that impersonating a police officer was a federal crime that could result in serious jail time. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said to Dolores, his voice taking on the formal tone that cops use when they're about to arrest someone, "are you telling me that you know this individual who impersonated a police officer on Mr. Corbin's property?" The live stream chat was going absolutely wild at this point, with viewers commenting in real time about the unfolding legal drama. "She's going down," wrote someone from Nevada. "Felony charges incoming," predicted a viewer from Florida. "Best reality TV ever," commented multiple people, and I realized that thousands of people were witnessing the complete collapse of Dolores' criminal enterprise in real time. But the legal consequences were just the beginning of Dolores' problems. As Officer Rodriguez was taking statements and preparing to make arrests, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the edge of the flood zone, and men in expensive suits began stepping out of vehicles with a kind of careful precision that suggested they were very unhappy about getting their shoes muddy. The Pinnacle Development executives had apparently decided that a flooded potential development site warranted an emergency site visit, and their timing couldn't have been worse for Dolores' reputation or her financial prospects. "Mrs. Tatum," the lead executive called across the water, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes with controlling millions of dollars in development money. "This flooding wasn't mentioned in any of your environmental assessments." Dolores turned toward the executives with the desperate expression of someone watching their payday literally floating away. But her movement caused her to lose her footing in the muddy water, and she went down with a splash that sent ripples across her submerged rose garden. The live stream audience erupted in comments and laughing emojis as Dolores struggled to stand up in water that was deeper than she'd expected, her carefully maintained authority dissolving along with her makeup. "Gentlemen," I called to the Pinnacle executives, making sure my phone was positioned to capture both them and the flooding. "Welcome to Meadowbrook Ranch's new wetland preserve." The executive who seemed to be in charge looked from the flooded properties to me to his muddy shoes, and I could see the exact moment when he realized that their multi-million-dollar development deal had just turned into an environmental liability. "This property is now classified as restored wetland," I continued, walking closer to the water's edge while keeping my feet firmly on dry ground. "Any development would require extensive environmental impact studies and federal permits that could take years to obtain." Officer Rodriguez finished taking statements from Daniel Tatum, who'd apparently decided that cooperating with the investigation was preferable to facing federal charges for impersonating a police officer. "Mrs. Tatum," Rodriguez announced, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, filing false police reports, and abuse of authority." As he began reading Dolores her rights, while she stood in ankle-deep water wearing a soaked bathrobe, the Pinnacle Development executives were having their own crisis management meeting next to their expensive vehicles. "The environmental liability is too high," I heard one of them say. "We need to terminate this partnership immediately." Justice was flowing as fast as the floodwater, But Dolores had one last card to play, and it was going to backfire spectacularly. 6 months later, I'm standing on my front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the morning sun reflect off the permanent wetland preserve that used to be Dolores Tatum's real estate empire. The environmental impact assessment confirmed what Harlan and I had suspected all along. This area had been natural wetland for thousands of years before developers decided to fill it in and build expensive houses on unstable ground. The county had officially designated the entire flooded section as protected habitat, which meant that not only was development permanently prohibited, but property values in the surrounding area had actually increased because of the environmental protection status. The legal consequences for Dolores had been swift and comprehensive. Federal charges for the fake police officer scheme resulted in 18 months in federal prison, while state charges for fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of authority added another 2 years to her sentence. The IRS got involved when they discovered that HOA funds had been diverted to personal accounts, and civil lawsuits from affected homeowners stripped away what remained of her assets. Her nail salon was sold to pay legal fees, her house was foreclosed on, and the last I'd heard, she was living in a trailer park 3 counties away, probably measuring grass with a ruler, just like she'd forced me to do. The transformation of the neighborhood had been remarkable in ways that went far beyond just the physical landscape. With Dolores gone and her corrupt HOA board dissolved, residents had elected new leadership focused on transparency, fairness, and community building rather than harassment and fraud. Harlan Vance had been chosen as the new HOA president, bringing 3 decades of practical experience and a commitment to treating residents like neighbors rather than subjects. The first thing the new board had done was rescind all of Dolores's fraudulent violations and refund the excessive fines that had been used to fund her personal enrichment scheme. My property had become something of a local landmark, not just because of the viral live stream that had exposed Dolores's corruption, but because of the memorial garden I'd finally been able to create for my mother. The spot I'd chosen overlooked the new wetland preserve, where herons and egrets had returned to hunt in the shallow water, and native plants were beginning to reclaim the landscape. I'd scattered Mom's ashes among the wildflowers she'd always dreamed of planting, and her fishing locket now hung from a small memorial stone that marked the place where her dreams had finally come true. The livestream video had taken on a life of its own, becoming one of those internet phenomena that people share whenever they need proof that justice still exists in the world. Last count, it had been viewed over 2 million times, spawned dozens of copycat videos about HOA corruption, and inspired environmental activists across the country to look more closely at development projects in sensitive ecological areas. I'd started getting calls from people dealing with their own HOA nightmares, asking for advice about documentation, legal strategies, and the fine art of turning bureaucratic bullying into public humiliation. Tank had refused any additional payment for the moving delays and complications, claiming that watching Dolores get arrested on live stream was worth more than money. "Boss," he'd said, "in 20 years of moving families, I've never seen justice served with such perfect timing. That was better than any overtime pay." He'd also become something of a local celebrity, with his commentary during the live stream being quoted and memed across social media. His moving company had gotten so much business from the viral video that he'd had to hire additional crews and upgrade his equipment. The environmental restoration had exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 3 months of the flooding, native wildlife had returned to the area in numbers that surprised even the county environmental specialists. Migratory birds were using the wetland as a rest stop, fish populations in the connected lake had increased dramatically, and the water quality improvements had been measurable and significant. What had started as an act of revenge had become a genuine environmental success story that was being studied by restoration specialists from universities across the state. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the whole experience had been the phone call I'd received just last week from someone who'd seen the viral video and needed help with their own HOA situation. "Wesley," the caller had said, "we have an HOA president who's trying to force out elderly residents so developers can buy their properties cheap. Can you help us?" It turned out that Dolores's scam wasn't unique, that there were HOA boards across the country using similar tactics to enrich themselves at the expense of homeowners who trusted them to act in the community's best interests. "Well," I'd replied, grinning as I looked out at the thriving wetland preserve that had once been Dolores's carefully manicured symbol of authority, "I do know a thing or two about water management and environmental restoration. Sometimes the best way to deal with corruption is to help Mother Nature take back what was always hers." Tank had happened to be visiting when I got in that call, and he'd started loading his truck with equipment before I'd even hung up the phone. "Road trip, boss?" he'd asked, and I'd realized that using my retirement years to fight HOA corruption might just become my new purpose. So that's how I turned an HOA tyrant's million-dollar real estate scheme into a permanent wetland nature preserve. Dolores wanted waterfront property, and I gave her all the water she could handle. She thought she could intimidate me into abandoning my mother's dream, but she forgot that patience, persistence, and a deep understanding of natural water flow can be more powerful than any amount of bureaucratic bullying. Remember, folks, when life gives you corrupt HOA boards, sometimes the best solution isn't a lawyer or a lawsuit. Sometimes it's just helping Mother Nature reclaim what was always rightfully hers. And if you're fighting your own HOA Karen right now, you know where to find me. The water's always flowing toward justice.